he's hilarious. Up there.
2 or 3 years ago, yeah.
Up there.
Because he said, why are we renting a place for the summer?
Yeah.
When it's like, well, like his first he was just staying.
Hello. How are you? I'm good. How are you?
Good morning. Good to see you, man. Good to see you again. Pleasure. Of course.
Good morning, everybody.
Oh, we got to fix that.
Yeah.
Get you down here
Done.
tomorrow.
Welcome to the Miller Center.
Technically fixed at this moment.
If you've got a cell phone, can you please turn it off or at least silence it so it does not go off during the show? That is my only announcement today. We're going to be starting in just a few minutes. Thanks. And we'll be starting in a few seconds. Thanks.
Better have good remarks.
Okay. I guess, should we leave our phones in?
Yeah.
Okay. Okay. Okay.
Have you come
I
back?
guess, okay.
I'm kicking this to you,
Yes.
right? And then you're going to introduce the panel.
That's right.
Okay, good. Yeah. Great. You got to leave that on, huh?
Ooh.
I'm always the other person on the other side of the door. Bang.
Oh, are we in the right order, Christy? Where you? Okay, so this. Okay. Got it.
Good morning.
Okay.
Hello.
Hey there.
So which side?
How are you?
Towards the television or away from it? Thank you.
Okay.
Oh, this is a cool looking room.
Isn't this cool?
This is cool.
Yeah. Is Gracie here yet? 21st birthday. Yeah. Okay. Okay. Next to Nikki. Okay. Go this way.
So what's your daughter doing this summer?
This one is going up to Harvard and getting a real estate investing certificate because she's an urban planner, and apparently urban planners need a little finance and accounting,
Yeah.
and that makes you more likely. Hey,
Exactly.
oh, I want to talk to Randy Barvin's here. How
We
about
should
that?
have the wigs on.
Yeah. Cool.
And I like the little clock
And
idea.
then,
This is kind of neat.
And then the other one's third year in Baton School.
Did you just get him yesterday
But that's
also?
the one with the 21st birthday yesterday, and she's not here yet.
And you guys are down in Alexander as
you're
well, aren't you?
really pushing it.
Yeah,
Did the
maybe
same-
I'm realistic.
I've landed from San Francisco.
Because
they
she
took me
might not have
straight
anything to
from
do
the
today,
airport.
but she has something she needs to do today, which is sleep in.
Sleep and get off the hangover, yes.
Yes.
But extra
No.
gold stars for her. She knows it.
Yeah, we'll see. We'll see. And if she doesn't, I'm not going to get mad. I did have a dream that she had.
She'll be disowned, but
I dreamt that she came home with tattoos. So when you said that, I was like, oh my God, I had that.
okay. Does that sound better?
Okay. Because we've made it pretty clear.
No, so to make things more fun,
she'll
I split the week between two
That's what I think.
scenes.
You better wait a year. Yeah.
Yeah.
But she's not a
My wife
tattoo
is
side.
taking jobs.
I was going to say, if we did that to me,
And I'm like, go honey.
Yeah.
And they normally have the Alaska Airlines.
Try the fake ones first.
Yeah.
But it was sold
See if you
out.
like it. Then, but
So I just stopped at that.
yeah.
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 So when I was just for the
So where are you in San Fran?
We're in the Presidios.
Nice.
So it's really neat.
Yeah.
And they approached it quite well.
That's all you need.
Good morning. Here we go. Good morning. Great to see everybody. Welcome. Very special event today. I'm starting out on a sad note. Many of you may have heard the passing of a governing council member of the Miller Center, Dick Kreitler, but particularly on an event of this topic, Dick was a proud, passionate, big mind, big-hearted conservative, and I know he would have been here today. Dick was a graduate of Washington and Lee. He actually grew up in the town next to the one that I grew up in, New Jersey, so Dick felt like a lifelong friend and relative from the minute I met him. Graduate of Washington and Lee and also George Washington, where he did a master's in diplomatic history. And he used that first to teach and then went into investing, worked at Goldman Sachs for a number of years, started his own investing company, and then developed a golf course, did a bunch of other things, and retired here to Charlottesville, where he was part of our governing council since 2005. We will all deeply miss Dick. He was a real force in this place. And I know he would have been here for today's topic. He not only loved conservative thought, he loved the nuances and the debates within the Republican Party and among conservative thinkers, and that's what we're hoping to bring to you today. And one question may be, why are there so many debates when Republicans are in charge? They are large and in charge right now. They control the presidency, both houses of Congress, the Supreme Court, 33 governorships, 33 state legislatures, that is 32 where they control both houses, and Nebraska where there's only one house and they control that. 85% of Republicans, self-identified Republicans, support the president. They passed a massive tax cut and have moved forward on a series of big deregulation. So you would think that this would be a happy party and movement. Yet, as I was tying my George Will bow tie this morning, I don't know if you reflected or had a chance to read and reflect on George Will's column this morning, which will peel your skin off if you read it. It is an extraordinary commentary, not just on the president, but on the vice president. And I thought to myself, when was the last time the leading columnist of one political ideology and party attacked a sitting president? I think you have to go back to Walter Lippmann during the late 60s with Lyndon Johnson. Johnson had awarded Walter Lippmann the Congressional or the Presidential Medal of Freedom. And by the time the Vietnam War was raging, Walter Lippmann had turned on the president. And it feels to me that we're at one of these moments. Is it all about Donald Trump? And it's, by the way, it's not just George Will, it's Bill Kristol, Pete Wehner, Mike Gerson, and a number of other conservatives, but not all conservative thinkers or political actors. So why is that? Is it just Donald Trump's style, his communication style, the controversies surrounding him, or is it his policies? Not just Russia, although that's certainly a part of the storm, his views about democracy both at home and abroad, his views on trade and on deficits. A recent poll listed 85% of Republicans supporting the president, but when you ask those same people, do they support the president's policies on trade, it's down to 70%. Moreover, are we looking at a smaller Republican Party as a result of this president? Most polls usually have Republicans, hard Republicans at 30% of the electorate, full Republican leaners at 42 or 43%. Those numbers are down to about 27 and 37. So today we have a terrific panel to explore those and other issues. I want to thank a few people who have pulled today's event together and then turned it over to our moderator. The first two people to thank are Mary Kate Carey, who is one of our panelists, and Christina Lopez-Guittardi Chow, who coordinates all of our events here at the center. First to Mary Kate. Mary Kate is a graduate of the University of Virginia. She graduated a year before me. Thank you, Fred. Many of you have heard me tell the story before, but I'll tell it again. When Mary Kate graduated, she went off a few years later and was a speechwriter on the George H.W. Bush presidential campaign. I was an advance person for the Dukakis campaign, which meant I rearranged deck chairs on the Titanic. You know who the smarter person of the two of us was. Mary Kate immediately went to work at the White House, where she worked on over 100 addresses for President Bush. She then produced a documentary about President Bush by President Bush. It was 41 on 41, him telling his own story, which obviously works very closely here with the work that we do at the Miller Center, which is one of the reasons that when I started here, I reached out to Mary Kate and pulled her in to be one of our senior fellows, which we were proud to have her do. She worked on our first year project, was on the advisory council for that. She also has a podcast called Bipartisan that she does with a former Democratic speechwriter. She's on the Judson Welliver Society, which is the Society of Speechwriters, as well as the Jeane Kirkpatrick Society, which is a group of columnists on the conservative side. She is, are you now the vice chair of the College Board? On the College Foundation Board, is the vice chair of the College Foundation Board here at the university, and is a real important member of our team. So we're delighted to have Mary Kate and Mary Kate to help us pull this together today, along with Christina Guittardi Lopez Chow, who runs our public events series, PhD in history, but a wide-ranging intellect on so many different issues, has written particularly on the role that different ethnic minorities play in American politics, with a focus on the Cuban American community and the very complex politics around this community, somebody that understands these issues very well. So thank you, Christina. And I also want to thank, where is Bunny? Bunny, who helps welcome people at our events today. This is one of our last season, but an event that has been designed and built by women I wanted to reach out to. The first volunteer here at the Miller Center, who is often greeting you today. And finally, Bunny Shepard. And finally, with that, I want to pass it to Nikki Hemmer, who is an assistant professor here at the Miller Center. She is in our presidential recordings program, where she is working on the media during the Nixon administration and understanding how the Nixon administration dealt with the media. She is herself an author on the conservative media. Her book, Messengers of the Right, has been widely and favorably reviewed in a number of different journals, including reading again this morning the review in the Washington Times, which, as you know, is the conservative paper of Washington, D.C. And it is an effusive review for a book written by somebody who, though not herself a conservative, really understands the conservative movement, and that comes from, and I'm sure she'll tell this story, and if she doesn't, I'll tell it quickly, her own debates and discussions with her own family, starting with her father. And anybody that's had a conservative father knows and understands how informative those conversations can be. So with that, and I should also say Nikki has her own podcast, Past Present, thank you, and also manages for the Washington Post a blog called Made by History, which pulls some of the best writing from American academic historians, but for a popular audience. So with that, Nikki, over to you.
Thanks very much, Bill. So I'm going to briefly introduce our panelists, and then we're going to dive right into this, because I think there's probably quite a lot to talk about when it comes to the state of conservatism and the Republican Party today, and where it goes next, where conservatives go from here. So Bill has already generously introduced Mary Kate Carey, who is a senior fellow here at the Miller Center and served as a speechwriter for George H.W. Bush, authoring more than 100 of his presidential addresses.
Sorry.
And you've heard all of her many other positions from Bill. Ron Christie is founder and CEO of Christie Strategies, a full-service communications and issue management firm in Washington, D.C. He is also the author of 3 books, including his most recent, Black Words: How Black Leadership is Returning America to the Days of Separate but Equal. He's the co-founder of NoLabels.org, a nonpartisan group seeking real policy solutions in Washington, D.C., and served as a special assistant to President George W. Bush and a deputy assistant to Vice President Dick Cheney. And then sitting next to him is Molly Hemingway, who is a senior editor for The Federalist and a contributor to Fox News. Her work has appeared in the Wall Street Journal, the Washington Post, National Review, First Things, and the Claremont Review of Books. She's held several journalism fellowships, including the 2014 Lincoln Fellowship at the Claremont Institute, and with her husband Mark, a distinguished fellowship in journalism at Hillsdale College. So with that, let's dive into where conservatism is today. I think that Bill nicely laid out some of the tensions that have developed over the last few years. And I'm curious whether we are at a different moment, because in 2009, 2010, with the rise of the Tea Party, I think there was a sense that we were in the midst of a conservative resurgence. And as Bill pointed out, now that Republicans are back in power, it seems to be more of a time of confusion, at least in the way we think about the Republican Party and conservatives more broadly. So what does it mean to be a conservative today?
Would that be me?
Ladies first.
I would say what has not changed is that most people who call themselves conservatives believe in a pretty good list of operating principles, some more than others, which is where I think some of the tensions have come up. But I sat down last night and came up with a list of things that I think most conservatives would agree with. It's certainly not an exhaustive list, and if you guys want to pipe in and add a few more. I said first and foremost, limited government, the rule of law, a belief in opportunity, and certainly equality of opportunity, and then back to the Constitution, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Or is that Declaration? Sorry, Declaration of Independence. And then there are sort of operating behaviors that I think most conservatives would hold in common. And on that list, I had compassion, choice, decentralization, an aversion to bureaucracy. But I think we could come up with more. But in general, if any given proposal, public policy proposal, the more of those that you can check off, the more conservative it is. And then there are times where the tension arises when you have to trade off or choose between them. So for example, I'm a free trader, and I would say that imposing tariffs would not be a conservative principle, a conservative solution to things, because it trades off equality of opportunity, and that the government is expansively picking winners and losers. So therefore, I would say free trade is more of a way as an opportunity to build economic growth through equality of opportunity. So that's where the tensions start coming in, is which trade-offs are more important and which principles, how would you prioritize those principles? But I'd be curious to hear how you guys feel about, are there things you would add to that are sort of umbrella operating assumptions for most conservatives. But that's where the movement is today, I think, and then the tensions arise because of the cross currents of various factions who believe one principle is more important than the other.
Good morning to you all. I thank you very much for being here. I will take everything that you said and agree with it, and then boil it down to 2 words. And I think those 2 words are choice and opportunity. And I say choice and opportunity because I was raised in Palo Alto, California, and of course you dutifully, as a black member of the Palo Alto citizenry, you immediately go and you check the box to become a Democrat, because that's what you do. And I just remember running into my congressman in the grocery store, Tom Campbell, and we were talking about politics, and he had asked me, what do you think about Republicans? And I said, I don't know anything about Republicans. And he said, why don't you come in Washington and intern for the summer and see what you think? And I left that thinking, Republicans give you the choice to believe what you want to believe. If you believe in a limited government, if you believe in strong national defense, if you believe in strong economics, that's your choice. But the opportunity part really got me. The opportunity that you can be any color, any religion, any ethnicity, and that you'll be embraced by this party because that's who we are, because we believe in freedom. And I differentiated myself as a Republican and as a conservative by the choices and the opportunities that the party gave me, rather than the limitations and some of the roadblocks that have been put up, because if you're black and you're from California, you're supposed to think a certain way, act a certain way, be a certain person. And I've held those principles and embraced those for everything that Mary Kate said, but you can just boil it down, at least in my life, of those 2 words, choice and opportunity, of what I think conservatism means today.
So I think that to some extent we overstate the problems that are happening in the conservative movement or the Republican Party. The conservative movement has always found, or has long found, a home in the Republican Party, but both groups are coalitions of different streams of thought. And that has always been the case. It's not just now. I mean, whether you're libertarian or traditional or an anti-communist or some other thing that motivates you, it has always been a coalition of people who don't agree on everything. And people act like right now is this really unforeseen moment, but we didn't hear the same things under George W. Bush when he was passing steel tariffs, which he did push, when he was doing war policy in a way that is contradictory to what a lot of conservatives think about how to manage defense. When he was passing Medicare Part D, we didn't see a never Bush moment. We didn't see a movement like that, even though those things are very much in contradiction with what you might call conservative orthodoxy. So I think when we talk about this tension, it really is a tension between elites who have risen to the top of conservative organizations and to some extent the conservative principles that do unite these disparate groups.
So just kind of following up on that, why do you think there wasn't a never Bush moment in the 20-aughts when these kinds of decisions that seem to be out of step with the conservative mainstream are being made versus with Donald Trump?
Right. I think it's a really good question that helps explain how Trump rose to prominence as well. Mm-hmm. So if you opposed the handling of the Iraq War, either going into the Iraq War or how it was being fought, there was extremely strong pushback from conservative leaders. You might remember National Review had a cover story called Unpatriotic Conservatives, and it was about people who had problems with interventionism as a general philosophy, or going into wars where you don't have a strong exit plan, an idea about how to win, an idea of whether that war even should have been fought. It was extremely difficult to push back against elite consensus. And what happens when you make it that someone can't even have a disagreement is they stop working with you and they start looking for ways to make their voice heard. And so I think it was that failure to really be thinking through, it's not just that too. You look at the foreign policy, you also look at how elite Republican opinion had come to support things like too big to fail and crony capitalism for corporations, or an immigration policy where the views of the people weren't very well incorporated into the actual policies. And so you keep forcing these issues where you're not actually listening to what people say, they will eventually push back. And that happens on both left and right, and it's not a bad thing. It's actually a good thing, and it's what people should do in self-government. And it's only considered a bad thing because it's disruptive to people who are in elite positions.
Would you say, and this is for anyone on the panel, is that elite more conservative than the base? Is the base more conservative than the elites, or is conservatism not the most useful way of understanding that disconnect? Because we have seen, I think, a disconnect in terms of policy, as you've mentioned. And I think one way that we can kind of get at this is to think about the 2012 Republican autopsy, where Republican leaders and conservative leaders kind of came together and said, this is the direction in which the party must move. We must reach out to women, we must reach out to people of color, we must push for immigration reform. And then in 2016, the candidate who wins the Republican nomination is someone who is the direct inverse of the recommendations of that autopsy. So how can we understand that disconnect?
Well, I think our Republican conservative leaders blew it, right? You saw the genesis of this with the Tea Party when you had President Obama. And what did the Tea Party stand for? It was taxed enough already. And Republicans said, if you give us the Congress, we're going to roll back your taxes. We're going to do all these things. We're going to get rid of Obamacare. If you give us the White House, we're going to do all these things and we're going to deregulate. And then, of course, what happens? Republicans take the House. Republicans take the Senate. Republicans get everything that they said that they wanted to do, and they didn't have a plan, they didn't have a strategy, they didn't have an ideology for actually putting forth a coherent policy agenda for all the promises that they made. And so I think that there is a disconnect between the base, the populace that said, we elected you, we did all these things, and now you're not actually following through on your promises, and you're part of the problem, no longer part of the solution. And I think that led to the swell of the anger that led us to Trump, which is we can't even trust our own leaders. We gave them every lever of power that they asked for. They still didn't have a plan to repeal Obamacare after 7 years. They still didn't have a deregulatory framework in place. And for goodness sakes, what do we stand for as a party if we stand for nothing other than giving the Democrats everything that they want?
I will say I did a lot of reading going into the 2016 election of Pew and Gallup and numbers like that. And what they were showing was fewer and fewer people were identifying themselves as members of the two parties, and more people were identifying themselves as independents. What was interesting and not getting reported much is that independent does not necessarily mean moderate. And many people who were conservatives were calling themselves independents. And I think that went sort of undetected because of the reasons you were just saying, that the Tea Party movement was the beginning of this, protest against the size and scope of government, and they felt disaffected by both parties, and that also led to Trump getting elected. They were off the radar and surprised a lot of people, I think.
I think one of the other things that surprised a lot of people, and this is definitely true among people who study conservatism as academics and scholars, is what is at least a perception of an inconsistency in conservatism. And that's kind of, I'd love to hear your thoughts on conservatism as a consistent ideology. And just to point out some things, so the tariffs that you brought up. And I think it is important to note George W. Bush's support for tariffs. But what we saw in polls in recent years is that, in the last year, is that Republicans went from a full support for free trade to much more support for things like protectionist policies and tariffs. So that's a pretty big shift on what I think most people would see as a core conservative stance, that we support free markets and free trade. Or in the case of evangelicals, who have been the strongest supporters of Donald Trump, a lot of outside observers look at that and they say, well, why there's an inconsistency here to support someone who doesn't necessarily represent this moral vanguard that white evangelicals believe in. So is that an inconsistency? What's happening there? How can we best understand what's happening in that part of conservatism?
Right. I think that the change in economic policy has been stunning to watch and disconcerting too. It used to be just almost a reflexive orthodoxy that you support free trade, and you would have been written out of the room if you said anything to the contrary, and now people are very open to tariffs. Having said that, I do think it's a little bit more complicated than a lot of the conversations have been. There is a power imbalance going on internationally with China. People sense some issues there. They understand that China has been welcomed into the most powerful nations. It has been given the benefit of behaving as if they practice free trade when they don't. The idea, this crosses across both parties, was if you treat China like a respectable partner, they will live up to it. So they were allowed entry into the World Trade Organization. And in return, they've done just massive intellectual property theft. They practice nothing but unfair trade practices. And it really is causing a power problem where the United States has less purchasing power than China. That is a significant issue. And people who oppose tariffs should probably be thinking of good ways to combat this rather than just opposing tariffs. Like, I actually also have problems with tariffs. I don't think they work as their proponents claim they work. If they are used more as a bargaining chip, I'm sort of okay with it. It's worthy of a bigger and richer and deeper conversation, but I don't think it's just straight up hypocrisy among conservatives who are looking to do something. And similarly, if I could address the evangelical issue, I think there has been a lot of really unfortunate smearing of evangelicals in how they chose to vote. First and foremost, people must remember that this didn't happen in a vacuum. The choices for evangelicals were literally Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump. They had to make a decision between these two people. Both have moral failings, and one was promising to continue policies that have been extremely harmful to religious people. There have been massive changes in the culture and legal framework regarding religious liberty in this country, and it was happening extremely quickly. And the idea that people would just sit down and accept it because in order to vote for the person who would stop it and would work against it because he had moral failings, I think is unrealistic, and I think it's unfair to act like they were just running into the arms of someone like Donald Trump. Having said that, I think it's important for people to make sure that they maintain their moral standing and condemn immoral behavior, not just if it's in terms of infidelities, which we've seen not just with Donald Trump, but with a lot of media leaders and other people who are prominent, but also in other things like how we talk about our fellow man and what our rhetoric is like and our civility, which is a problem, again, not just for Donald Trump, but for other people.
Anyone else want to weigh in on that? On the consistency?
Nope. What she said.
I think part of it too is a reaction. Well, let me back up. I think part of it could be the way things have been positioned. So, for example, the 1990 budget deal, which a lot of people think was the end of George Bush's presidency, when he agreed to raise taxes, he'd be the first to say that President Reagan raised taxes and positioned it as, I had to be dragged kicking and screaming to this. And that's what President Bush should have said, that he had to be dragged kicking and screaming. It was the only thing he could do to get the spending caps in place. He would say he was a court low on charisma, and that President Reagan was able to have a full tank of charisma. And so similarly, like Molly's saying, if the tariffs were, say, a bargaining chip, and you say, I'm being dragged kicking and screaming to this, that might have been a little more palatable to a lot of people. But when you also think about the evolution over the years that I remember working on speeches in 90, 92 about the difference between Wall Street and Main Street, and that George Bush was trying to position himself as a Main Street conservative. And over the years, I would make the argument that certainly by the time we got to Hillary Clinton, she was seen as a Wall Street supporter, and the Republicans were not. The fact that she wasn't campaigning in the middle of the country much, and that's where you had all the steel workers and all the people who were being treated unfairly by some of these trade deals, created a natural opening for him because they were the forgotten people. And so a lot of this was the realities of just the politics on the ground in 2016, and it doesn't necessarily signal to me hypocrisy. It's how these things are presented and what could have been said that wasn't. So,
I think there's one other thing worth considering too about the consistency issue, which is the conservative movement operates in part to be oppositional to progressivism. And I would argue that conservatism has been far, far, far more consistent than what you see in progressivism, which has radically changed on really big issues in a very short period of time. And if what your job is to, as National Review has their motto, standing athwart history, yelling stop, if you're trying to stop radical change that is done in an unthinking fashion or without due diligence about how change might affect or have second or third order effects, you will be doing different things depending on what the change is that is being proposed. And we have seen, just if you think about something like redefining marriage, which went from something that nobody was in favor of a few decades ago to being enforced by judicial fiat. That's a massive change that can affect how conservatives are oppositional to.
Let me build on that point, because I think what Molly just said is so important. When you look at what the core conviction of being a conservative is, I mean, conservatives by and large believe that marriage is between a man and a woman. A lot of conservatives believe that intersex marriage, look, that's your business, but it shouldn't be the state's business. And it seems to me that, as you've noted, that progressivism, it has evolved of if we can't win in the legislative arena, if we can't win using the executive powers, then we're going to get what we want by judicial fiat. And that's one thing that you have not seen conservatives do, is to go to the courts to advance their political ideological beliefs, whereas I think progressives have done so, much to the detriment of the country in the last 10, 12 years that I would have thought as a lawyer is unthinkable.
I want to pick up on a journal that Molly name-checked as a way of getting into conservative intellectuals, National Review. I think that for people who study conservatism from the outside, conservatism has long been seen as an intellectual movement, or a movement that has a strong intellectual heart, and that as conservatives moved into the Republican Party, that the Republican Party became the party of ideas. A lot of the people that Bill named who are unhappy right now are conservative intellectuals. And in fact, National Review during the campaign runs its Against Trump issue. Is there a disconnect between conservative intellectuals and the Republican Party now? And to what extent are these conservative intellectuals sort of keepers of the flame for conservative ideas and ideology? And to what extent are they just too disconnected from the conservative movement more broadly?
Oh, that's a tough question. I'll wave to the camera because I'm sure that a lot of these guys will be watching this and saying, oh, Christy said what? I think, we all know these people that you've mentioned. Rich Lowry, Pete Wehner, you can go straight, Mike Gerson, David Frum, people who I think that in their mind, they believe that they're the keepers of the flame, that they're the old guard, that they are the, for lack of a better word, the establishment. There, I said it. And I think that they have not recognized where the country has gone. A lot of these folks spend a lot of their time in Washington, D.C., or in New York City, or in Boston, otherwise known as the Acela Corridor, and they talk to the same people, they go to the same parties, and they have the same intellectual discussions. And I sit here and think to myself, well, gee, when was the last time you've been to Davenport, Iowa, you've been to Sparks, Nevada, you've been to Manchester, New Hampshire, and talked to people on the ground, people whose bread and butter issues aren't what's going to be on cable news, but what affects my town, my husband, my daughters, the people that I hang out with. And I think that's where the disconnect is, that they aren't hearing those voices. And so, yes, I do believe that they think that they are the holders of the flame or the old guard. But the disconnect that I've found of talking to people across the country in so-called flyover country is that the priorities of those folks are different than the priorities of the people in these journals that conservatives prescribe to be the sort of establishment bill of record.
Oh, go ahead.
Go ahead.
I was going to say that I think part of the disconnect is writing thought leadership pieces versus holding elective office. And it goes back to the old Reagan line. Landon Parvin's here, one of the great Reagan speechwriters. And President Reagan had this great line that is, I'm going to write it down, the person who agrees with you 80% of the time is a friend and an ally, not a 20% traitor. And I don't think that is how a lot of people feel these days in the intellectual end of the conservative movement. I think on the ground, I remember President Bush, again, sorry for the 1990 budget deal, him saying, is this the best deal possible? No. Is this the best deal possible with this Congress? Yes. And he was able to get the spending caps. He had to trade raising taxes for it, but those spending caps led to surpluses of the 1990s and the economic boom of the Clinton years. So that feeling of sort of, half a loaf is better than no loaf is not necessarily what the intellectual journals are prescribing. And I think the people on the ground in the states you're talking about, and certainly in Congress, Paul Ryan being the top, trying to figure out what is possible to navigate between the Democrats and between President Trump and between the principles that we all want to enact is a very difficult balancing act, and I give them a lot of credit. But I think that's where some of the disconnect is.
I think it's also worth noting that a lot of these intellectuals who oppose Donald Trump are opposing him in an emotional way as opposed to an intellectual way. I think people do respect intellectual opposition. The George Will column today was worth mentioning. It is also worth noting he is not a Republican leader. He rather famously left the party. And many other people who are part of this Never Trump movement have been openly advocating electing Democrats as a way to stop Donald Trump. So it is not unreasonable that people who are part of the conservative movement view these people as outside the movement because they have kind of declared themselves to be outside or oppositional to conservative policy making and goals right now. They are intellectuals, and they're well known and well respected for their intellectual fights, but right now is not a very intellectual moment of opposition to Donald Trump. And it is interesting to watch. I don't know exactly why the opposition is happening so much, but there is a big disconnect, and it gets to underlying conservative principles too, which is we do believe in self-government, and we do believe that the people get a say in how things are being run, and that when they are upset with fidelity to constitutional governance, this is something to be listened to, and that is not well received right now in Washington, D.C.
So over time, the relationship between a movement and a party changes. And so part of what it sounds like you're describing is some conservatives who are starting to see a fissure or a difference developing between being Republican on one hand and being conservative on the other. Do any of you feel that the Republican Party is becoming less conservative, or is this just a more surface
That's
issue?
actually the opposite of what I'm saying, actually. I'm sorry, but if you look at the Trump administration, it is very legitimate that you might have problems with style or something like that. As a conservative, it is very difficult to argue that this is not a conservative administration, that they are doing things that we are told Republicans would do but somehow never get done. This is a cabinet that is just chock full of not just conservatives, but stalwart conservatives like Scott Pruitt or Betsy DeVos or other people who are well known as people who actually care about conservative policy and implementing it. Any deregulation that has happened, it really has, it's partly happened through Congressional Review Act, but at the initiation of this administration. And these deregulatory efforts have been massive and really key to economic growth. And there are things like getting out of the Paris Climate Accord, which we are told that any Republican would have done. Well, then why did Mitt Romney speak against Donald Trump leaving the Paris Climate Accord? That was the previous nominee for Republican, for president, and yet he opposed it. Getting out of the Iran deal, we heard so many Republicans say that this was a bad deal. Donald Trump campaigned on a claim that he would get out of the deal, and then he did it. And then some of the people who always said it was a bad deal are angry at him for getting out of the deal. But when you look at, things that conservatives actually care about, whether it is deregulation, social issues, or just like general policy reforms at the agency level, I think it's very difficult to make the case that this administration is not conservative. And in fact, might be much more conservative than any of the next Republican options.
So if these people who are outside of the party now aren't conservative intellectual leaders, who would you all say are the intellectual leaders of conservatism today?
It depends on what you're looking at, because I think are you talking about intellectual thought leaders in the sense of, say, a Rich Lowry from this great university, who I think is a remarkably smart guy, who has a lot of very interesting things to say, but he comes at it from an intellectual perspective. I think the question that I would ask is, who are the intellectual thought leaders in the conservative movement that are elected officials, or those who are the bench for when the Trump administration ends? Who are we going to look to next? Because it's always easier to write and to opine and to be scholarly, and it's an entirely different thing to govern. And I look and say, well, who's that bench? I mean, it's certainly not any of the folks who ran and ultimately lost for the presidency in the last cycle. And I can say this as one who I worked for John Kasich when he was in Congress. I worked for him as his debate coach when he was running for president. Of the folks that ran and lost, I think we're going to have to move beyond those people to find our new intellectual conservative thought leaders, because the people that we have now, the establishment, they've been there, they've done that, they're willing to negotiate a deal, not so much on principle, but just to check the box, as opposed to, here are my bedrock principles that I firmly and staunchly believe in, and I will not waver. The one thing I give the Democrats a lot of credit for, if you look at what they have advocated for the last several years, you look at them on issues such as gay marriage, you look at them on the progressive agenda they push, they will do everything possible to get it done. Hook, line, and sinker. And Republicans, we're sort of running around like we're chasing the car, and then we catch the car and we're not sure what to do with it. And I'm just not quite sure who the leaders are going to take us out of the wilderness once this administration's over.
What about you, Mary Kate? Any names spring to mind?
I would say, I sort of put them in two categories as well. The crowd that's on the more intellectual end, I would say I'm very curious to see what Arthur Brooks does next. He's the head of AEI and has announced that he's stepping down, just to get the next generation of leadership going. And there's a great speculation in Washington, where is he going to go, what's he going to do next, because he is, I think, terrific intellectually, but also knows how to run an organization and is not quite so ivory tower. Another is, what is Paul Ryan going to do next? And there's some speculation that he may replace Arthur Brooks, I guess, but it would be, he could, I think, Molly and I were talking about this over breakfast, that he could be a great force from the outside, now that he's got a second act ahead of him, and be curious to see what he does. I do think that the Republicans have a much better farm team pipeline that they have been cultivating over the last 10 years. The 1,000 seats that the Democrats have lost under Obama at the legislative level means there's a huge crowd out there moving all the way up. And so I would look to the governors pretty quickly. I'm not ready to give up yet on John Kasich. I think he could still run. Another one that I like is Greg Abbott, the governor of Texas. I think is a very intriguing guy. And so I think there's people out there in elected office at the state level that could turn out to be the next generation.
Wait, I'm not giving up my old boss.
Okay, good. Because I'm a fan of his. I think he'd be great.
I'm a little less knowledgeable on the politicians than when I think of the intellectual leaders, people who are writing things right now that are very interesting. I think that Victor Davis Hanson is astounding.
Yeah.
And he is, a classics guy. So normally you're reading about, the Peloponnesian War when you're reading him. But there's something about this farmer from the Central Valley of California. He just understands the moment and the historical significance of it in a way that very few other people do. Mm-hmm. I also think that when you look at the lack of success right now among conservative think tanks, there is a pretty notable exception with the Claremont Institute, which is based out of California. and was, unlike all other think tanks in their approach to the Trump ascendancy, just less hostile. They certainly had people who were hostile, but that wasn't all that they had. And Charles Kessler, I think, is someone very worth reading. He is one of the winners of the Bradley Prize, which is being awarded next week for conservative intellectual thought. And he is insightful and, again, has understood the problems with the bureaucracy and the progressive creation of the administrative state as the greatest threat to liberty that we face. And other people there too, just basically almost anyone you can read in the Claremont Review of Books I think is good. William Vogeley. Roger Scruton, not an American, but certainly very thoughtful on the importance of being a nation state and the moral case, the ethical case for why people should care about immigration policy. And he is very influential in how people think through these things. I also think Yuval Levin is someone who has just like an emotional distance that enables him to, again, look at the history of thought and its role in the debates that we're having right now. And also, I find him to be just very hopeful. Like, when I read him, I have hope about the possibility that the Republic can figure out a way to preserve itself. And David Azerrod at the Heritage Foundation is also someone I enjoy reading quite a bit. He is also focused on constitutional governance. One of my writers at the Federalist is a Canadian American. I think he's an American now, Ilya Shapiro. Yeah, he jokes about doing jobs that Americans won't do, defending the Constitution. There is something about people who come to this country and really love and believe in the beauty of the Constitution. But I also think that there is something that's interesting happening right now is that there are people who aren't conservative who are being conservative thought leaders. Like, they don't actually hold to conservative principles themselves necessarily, but they resist that sort of totalitarian Stalinist groupthink that is oppressing people and making it where you can't have good conversations. And I think it's worth reading some of those people, people like Camille Paglia, Amy Chua, Christina Hoff Sommers, I think, is very interesting to read. Caitlin Flanagan, who is such an outside thinker, which she comes from the left, but she challenges people from the left and people from the right. And then also, I think, sorry to go on so long with this, but there is a lot of disruption at the higher levels of conservative intellectual thought, but it's creating this opportunity for a lot of younger conservative and right-of-center thinkers. Camille Foster at Freethink, I think, is someone worth reading. Benjamin Weingarten. I think you're seeing like a lot of interesting new ideas in foreign policy that had been kind of in a very tightly controlled space. And Robbie Suave is one of the best minds focused on campus oppression and whatnot. So I think there's a lot happening, but we're not quite seeing who's actually, totally at the top right now, but not for lack of really interesting stuff.
So you see it as a very generative moment where there's now space for new names to kind of pop up and new people to make space. Yep. So I want to ask one more question, maybe two, and then open it up to the audience. One of them is just based on a piece that I read from a young conservative this morning for the Weekly Standard. Ben Shapiro was writing about what he sees as conservatism's youth problem, that young people traditionally are not conservative, but increasingly young people are more liberal and they're not changing. That they're not becoming more conservative as they grow older. And the way that he described this problem was that, he actually put it in an interesting way that I'm curious if you agree with. He said that Trump is a particular problem here because older conservatives judge Trump on his politics, whereas younger conservatives judge Trump on his values, and that there's a values disconnect between, say, millennials and conservatives, or the Republican Party, depending on how you want to define it. Do you see a young people problem for conservatism? And if so, how do you address it? How do you bring more young people into the conservative movement?
Yes. and you can certainly relate to this as a tenured professor, and I can give you my sense as an adjunct at Georgetown and at NYU. There is such a stifling fog of anti-conservatism that I haven't seen in my life. in politics. That if you are conservative, there's something wrong with you. If you're a person of color and you're conservative, there's really something wrong with you. And my students walk in and, you look when they put their laptops in the desk and I'm still with her and all the sort of different slogans. And as the semester kind of goes along, they realize that you don't have a tail and you don't have a horn in your head, and that you're not there to indoctrinate them, but you're there to educate them. And they've thought, well, I always thought conservatives were mean and anti-woman, anti-choice, anti-this, anti-that. And then they recognize that, again, the two words I started off with, choice and opportunity. Hey, I'm giving you the opportunity to benefit from some of my experiences, but it's your choice to make as to where you want to come from. So my young people problem is not so much one of, well, they're not aligning with Trump on values or they don't like Trump. I need to think, as an educator, how can I find a way? And I went to our president, John DeJoy, and I said, the scariest thing I ever heard in my classroom last semester was, Professor Christie, we think that your classroom is the only safe space that we have at Georgetown University for being conservatives. And I thought to myself, if you're using the terms of progressivism to describe my class as a safe space, we have a problem. So how do we, as those who are stewards of the conservative mantle, how do we, as those who want to expand our base in our party, reach out to young people who might be in college, who might still be in high school, and encourage them not to abandon their conservative thoughts, their conservative ideology, so that when they come to college, they can stand up and defend themselves. Because a lot of the conservatives at the schools that I teach at roll over and say, I would rather pretend that I'm with Hillary, I'd rather pretend that I'm in favor of whatnot, and then privately keep my counsel to those who are like me. And if you have to pretend to be something that you're not at an institution of higher learning, we've got a problem.
So when I teach classes on college campuses, usually it's just a day on speech writing or politics or something, and I'll say, okay, before we start, raise your hand if you're a Democrat. All the hands go up. Raise your hand if you're independent. Raise your hand if you're a Republican. Like total crickets. And then I say, okay, well, let me tell you where I'm coming from. I believe the following things. And I basically do a list of the principles, sort of like we did at the beginning. And I said, does anybody here agree with what I just said? All the hands go up. And I say, oh, you guys are all Republicans. And they go, oh, no, we are not Republicans. And I think it's a somewhat toxic label right now. I was at an event here probably 2 weeks ago on how to fix democracy. And it was undergrads, and they went from room to room in these discussion sections. The problem was it was a gorgeous Friday afternoon, and nobody had classes, and turnout was unexpectedly low. But one of the sessions was run by two young people who were in their mid-20s who were starting a party called the the Modern American Party, I think it's called. And it is conservative principles without the Republican name. And they're targeting it at young people. They've got social media. They're doing everything that you would want to do. The problem is, I think, ballot access. But I think that's where the intellectual energy is going to start going towards, is getting away from some of the labels, speaking of no labels, and go to governing philosophies and principles that we can all agree on. And I think that's where we'll get the young people to join us.
Yeah, I'm not sure if I have much to add, but this is the bad news part. A lot of what's happening in the country is due to decades of progressive education and failure to inculcate in all of us a love for our founding principles and what it takes to have self-government and what a delicate enterprise that is. And a lot of education is actually downright hostile to our Constitution and the principles in the Declaration. And to fix that is a very long process. People need to focus a great deal on educating our youth. That bears so much fruit over the long haul, but it's not a quick or easy fix. It's just important for us to preserve the republic, period. You have to have a shared love of something like our Constitution and what it enables us to do and how it enables people with different ideas to work together and exist together civilly in defense of the higher good.
All right, we will open it up to Q&A after one very quick question, which is conservatism in good shape today? Do you feel like is it a positive story right now, or is it more of a challenge?
yes to both. It's a total challenge right now, but I feel like there's more excitement and interesting stuff happening in conservatism right now than in a long time. When you think of what conservatism has been able to accomplish, a lot of those victories were those victories kind of stopped in the late 80s or early 90s. And people are ready for some victories. When we were going through the list of all the power that conservatives have, that's because the country is broadly conservative, but they're not seeing the impact of that reality in the policy. And I think that people are really pushing for that, and that is a healthy thing that suggests that people still do care about self-government and what it means.
I'd say yes to both also. I think when you look at the factors of the unemployment rate being where it is, the African American unemployment rate being the lowest since recorded history, you look at the sort of rollback of ISIS, the 3 hostages that were taken from Korea, that North Korea, we never even thought we could negotiate with them, of who do we stand for as a party and as a movement of bedrock for strong national defense, full employment, and allowing people the opportunity to achieve the American dream. Yeah, I think that we're doing pretty darn well right now, but we still have many challenges.
Yes, yes, and yes. And I don't think you can say that about the left right now.
No.
I don't think they have nearly the game that's going on the right. And John, one of our interns who's here today, said that Terry McAuliffe came to his school to speak, and John asked him, what are the 3 things the Democratic Party stands for right now? And apparently, John, tell me if I'm wrong, he said jobs, women's rights, and then you said, I can't remember the third. And so I think that it's not the same intellectual framework that I think you see much more on the right. So it gives me great hope. So I
He
think,
had his Rick Perry moment where he was like,
what was the other thing? Yeah. He had to write it on his hand. Yeah.
All right, well, let's open it up for questions. Christina has the microphone, so we are going to get those to you as quickly as possible. And if you'll just wait to have the mic, that way everyone at home can hear.
Hi, thank you so much for being here. It's so interesting for me. I'm very progressive, so I'm trying to learn. And to Nikki's last question, or second to last question, what would be your elevator speech to youth to try to get them to consider and understand more seriously the conservative movement, the conservative Republican agenda?
Usually the one I do is economic, because I think there's a slow-moving train wreck going on with our national debt. And I think that the rise of the administrative state, like Molly was talking about, is a great threat to our liberty, but it's also a huge national security threat in terms of the debt. And I think it's going to fall squarely on young people. And I think there's not a sense there that government can't do everything. I think a lot of people on the left think government's the first thing we should turn to solve all our problems. And I think young people need to understand that there's a great genius to the American people, and that there isn't a problem that isn't being solved somewhere in America, and we have to lift up those local solutions. And I think that has tremendous appeal to young people because they're so community service oriented. And I think if I can get them to say government isn't the first answer to everything, and I don't think that's what the left is saying to them. So that's the way I try to start.
And I'd look at it as diversity of thought. Why should you belong to a particular party if you are of a certain race or ethnicity, or have certain thoughts that therefore you must be a Democrat? I look at my students and say, we offer you the opportunity to be whoever you want to be, and we welcome that diversity, and that our strength is our diversity and our diversity is our strength. But if you're just going to start putting people in boxes and assuming certain values about a person just because of the way they look or what their gender is, I think you're going the wrong way.
I would say ordered liberty is a really important thing for a free and happy people. And there are threats to that from all sides, and there's wisdom through the ages that is worth learning about and working together to maintain it.
One of the things you listed right at the very beginning that a conservative stands for is limited government. And I think what government has taken over in this country is things that the family should be taking care of. And I think as a conservative, if I were in some leadership position, one of the main things I would focus on is doing what I could to bring back the core family as an integral part of our society. Not only integral, but essential. That so many of the problems that are out there right now have to do with parenting problems. Things, the schools can do a lot, got to do a lot more, and these concepts in universities are about our Constitution and how that's unraveling is terrible. But we've got to get back, I think, to making parents responsible. And I'm talking about a mother and a father that are married and are really looking after their children as the most important thing they can do. So my question is, if any of you were in a position, and if I could be, what advice is there to try to bring that about, to see what we can do to rectify that? Thank you.
First off, you're absolutely right. I mean, when you look at the data, almost every single major problem facing like young men can be is exacerbated by the loss of a father in the home. You know, whether it's literacy or drug use or incarceration or physical violence, all these things are really big problems facing a pretty big percentage of our young men and women. And of course it affects women and it affects the children that they create. And yet nobody talks about the importance of the family unit in helping children grow into fully functioning humans and citizens. And that is a scandal that we've spent decades ignoring this issue. It is a delicate topic, how to balance the importance of an intact family with the mother and father and the children they create through their union being together. You don't want to shame people who have failed to achieve that ideal, or you don't want to unduly shame that situation. But if you err too much in that direction, you end up like lying to people basically about the importance of this. I mean, partly this is a governmental issue, partly there have been policies that were created with the best of intentions that have led to a loss of importance of the father in the home. Partly, I think it's a huge media issue, which is the media don't understand issues in a complex fashion or in a deep way, and they shut down communication on some of these nuanced issues. And then also it's just at its core a character issue. This is our problem as a people, and that we ourselves have failed to live as we should. We have failed to encourage those near neighbors of ours to live as they should. It is hard to keep a marriage intact, but it is important to do so for men, women, and their children. And this is something that starts really at the home, how we interact with our own children and neighbors.
Let me tackle this from the perspective of the Second Amendment. You've seen some of the horrific shootings and gun violence ranging from Newtown, looking at Parkland in Florida, and then most recently in Maryland. And the first thing that you hear is, well, we need to have gun control, and we need to regulate arms, and we need to do these things. And then you look back to Newtown, and you find that it was a disturbed young man who lived in a single-parent household that had access to the guns. You look at Parkland, it was a young man who was not living in a nuclear family who had access to guns. You look at the Maryland situation, and it was a young man whose father had been told that his son was mentally ill and had given these firearms back to his son. And yet and still, what we hear out in the intelligentsia is that it's a government problem that government needs to solve. And I look at those three shootings and I say to myself, perhaps if there was a stronger bedrock of family and a sense of community, that they might not have happened. But yet it's not society's fault that everybody else should be made responsible for these actions, and we should regulate we should change our constitution or have regulations imposed when these are issues that can be dealt with in the home.
Yes, good morning. My name is Phil Williams. I have an observation to make and a question. One is on this question of having control of all the levers of power. I'm a little bit, and finding it difficult and discord surfacing, I find it analogous to when we won the Cold War, and it turned out that the peace dividend that everybody thought would be marvelous turned into a multipolar world, and the business of trying to choose your friends and enemies became ever so much more complicated. May have applications to the time when Democrats had control of all the levers for a period of time, and now the Republicans. My question goes back to this subject of tariffs. Leaving Smoot-Hawley aside, America has had tariffs for a variety of reasons, strategic reasons, for its entire history. What I find sort of interesting is people having knee-jerk reactions to tactical decisions made about talking about tariffs, maybe applying them, maybe not, but having a larger strategy, a more nuanced strategy to bring people to the negotiating table, which I think much more clearly describes the policies that are coming out of Washington and the Republican, never mind Democrat, the Republican tendency to knee-jerk react against that. It seems to suggest that they don't appreciate that negotiations take time and they take positioning. And there are times when we've had subsidies as well in this country where government has tried to pick winners and losers. I could mention Solyndra, for example. So I think people need to get a grip here on how America repositions itself as something other than, if you will, a sugar daddy at the negotiating table, which is a pleasure that we might have had in 1992 and 1993, but disappeared rapidly hence. Would appreciate your comments on my question. Thank you.
That's kind of what I was trying to get at in my remarks too. I think that there's no question that some of this imposition of tariffs or threatened imposition has led to people coming to the bargaining table. And Donald Trump, for instance, prefers to do a bilateral trade agreement over large trade agreements. There are benefits to doing them in both ways. We're not having a very deep conversation about it. And also, I think we're having an only economic conversation about it. Like it's pretty clear, although there's even some dissent on this, that tariffs are not helpful to the country that imposes them. This is not just an economic story. This is a story about national security. This is a story about what your relative power is compared to other people. And that's never part of the conversation. It's just about economics, and it's always about economics at the aggregate level. It is true that our recent trade practices can simultaneously be really good for the overall growth of the country, but have some pretty serious negative side effects for communities that you also care about. And that is just something we're not doing a very good job of talking about.
Is this on? Can you hear me? I'd like to keep this as simple as I possibly can, but I'll just give you a brief background. I'm a New Yorker who now lives in the hotbed of Washington, so what does that make me in Charlottesville at the moment? I'm a visitor here, and I'm very happy to be here. I want to refer to your statement, sir, about actually, it's my statement about the complexities. The people who speak towards gun control versus the people who speak towards mental health versus the people who speak towards more secure families and, right? What we're talking about cannot be an either or. It's a both and. And I think that kind of complexity eludes many people. They believe they have to take one side or the other. These are things that are multifaceted, and the complexity of them is really very apparent to me, always has been, except when I was way younger. It was much simpler then. But in fact, I will stand by that at any time when I hear it's you or us. It's us and them. I am with everyone of sound mind, hopefully, and speaking towards the future with hope and optimism, but an awareness of the complexity of needs that people have, the way they've been raised, et cetera, et cetera. Thank you.
Look, I totally agree with you, but as it relates to something like gun control, I don't think there's an either or. I mean, I think there's a constitutional bedrock in the ability for Americans to have the right to bear arms. And I just look at it of the suffocation effect of, if you look at Chicago, if you look at Washington, D.C., two of the bigger cities that have very strict gun control laws that also have some of the most rampant crime involved. And I look at the either or comparison and say, well, on one hand, you have to, one size fits all, you cannot have a gun or you have to be restrictive in your guns. I said, well, if that's how you feel as a municipal level, that's fine. But the Supremacy Clause trumps what's going on at state and local regulation, and that's why we have a Constitution. And until that right to bear arms changes in the Second Amendment, I think people should have the ability to defend themselves.
Hi, thanks. This is really enriching. Molly Hemingway mentioned Yuval Levin, and I want to pick that name up and register a mild dissent to, I thought, the overall message early on in the panel, which was Republicans weren't paying attention to what was going on in the middle of the country. I think Levin and his circle of so-called reformicons were, and they were, this is leading up to my question, which is reform conservatism in your minds a dead letter? I hope not. These are people like Mike Lee, Marco Rubio, some Ben Sass, paying attention to this set of writings, which is a challenge to this, all conservatism is about is cutting taxes and regulation. It's also about conserving things. These also tend to be people who don't like Donald Trump very much, right? The intellectual leaders. So right now they seem to be on the outs. But my question to you is this a dead letter? Is it still alive? Do you think there's a future for this particular type of very thoughtful conservatism?
I think it's actually kind of funny that they're so oppositional to Donald Trump, because you could define him as a reformicon as well. Someone who's very much focused on whether policies are good for the people is how I think of reformicons. Not just, there's this thing where the conservative movement got a little bit abstract and focused on like checking off how you felt about certain issues as opposed to really thinking through difficult policy issues. Reformicons were accused of lacking principle because they were trying to find these like broadly appealing policy changes that weren't totally conservative. I think, in fact, I myself was not enamored with the Reformicons, but I think that while the name might not be something you hear a lot, I think everyone is being forced to deal with the reality that government should be serving the people who created the government and who enable it to continue. And I think you're starting to see some people push through with that, actually on both left and right, really focused on that. And you see it's not just an American situation, it's a global phenomenon that people are saying, we get that this policy that you had created was really good for elites. We need it to be good for all of us if we're going to preserve our country or our system of government.
Could I thank, first of all, my colleagues here at the Miller Center, Nikki Hemmer and Mary Kate Carey, for putting together such a superb panel today, and thank our guests for coming. I want to ask you to drill down a little bit on the courts. As a scholar who studies both the presidency and the courts in this country, particularly the Supreme Court, to talk about their role, not only the Supreme Court, but the lower federal courts as well, in the conservative movement. And then just to say that it is the case that all of our political parties and all of our sides of political spectrums over the years have looked to courts to implement their policy preferences. I think we think of it in terms of liberals doing that starting in the 1930s with the social movement to find equality for African Americans, because there was no movement happening from the presidency or in Congress, and so the only alternative was to go to the courts. But then there was a reaction to that, for example, the Federalist Society, to try to have more conservatives placed on the court. I think of Mary Kate's boss, President Bush 41, and his two interesting appointments to the Supreme Court of David Souter and Clarence Thomas, who have had obviously two very different views of conservatism. So with that, could you talk about that? And again, the role of particularly the federal courts in the conservative movement as it is now, where President Trump is going with his appointments to the judiciary.
Well, I'm glad you brought it up, because I was hitting myself for not mentioning the many nominees that have happened out of this last administration is something that gives conservatives a lot of reasons to be extremely happy. I think it was also a big part of the 2016 story that conservatives understood that they might have to vote for someone that they didn't actually completely cotton to, in part because of just the significance of those judicial appointments and how much of an effect they can have on everybody's lives. I actually don't think it's a healthy thing that our courts have that much of an effect on ourselves, or even just like our ability to litigate contentious issues. There's an argument that even when you feel like you've reached the end of the limits of deciding things as a people, that you need to keep fighting, because it's much healthier for a republic for people to come to decisions together rather than have them imposed by the outside, even if you think there's an injustice at the moment. It's very important for people to argue and reason together and convince one another and persuade rather than use brute force. I do think this is a huge issue animating a lot of conservatives and almost unifying them, even if they have different ideas about the underlying issue at play. They generally want to see a judicial system that is restrained to deciding what the law says based on what it says, as opposed to moving too far beyond that, understanding that this is an issue on both left and right where people do move beyond it. But this is, I think, a really significant issue in conservative movement.
And I think it's a brilliant question. I think it's a brilliant question. I think it's a fascinating one to consider when you look at the issue of immigration. And you look at immigration both as it relates to DACA, and you look at immigration as it relates to the president's travel ban from certain countries. And district court judges have looked at what the president has done as it relates to restricting people from certain countries from coming in here and saying, oh, well, we are triers of fact, and we think, Mr. President, factually speaking, that you exceeded your authority using an executive order. And you look at that and you say, well, no, that's actually wrong. A district court judge, a single individual, should not be able to overrule the president's constitutional power to really impose who can come in and who can come out. And yet, then it has to go to the circuit court level, which looks at this as a matter of law, and that takes time, and eventually that will get to the Supreme Court, which will adjudicate the issue. But in the meantime, that has very significant national security issues for the country, and you say to yourself, is the court, the federal court, imposing limits on the executive's ability to conduct business in ways that harm our national security and our homeland security? And then you look at DACA, and President Obama famously said that he did not have the power under the Constitution to take the steps that he ultimately ended up doing. And now you have the fight of certain progressives are saying, well, that's not who we are as Americans. Well, the question is who we are as Americans is, aren't we a nation of rules, and aren't we believers in the rule of law? And the judiciary has tried to find ways to interpret things based on a political ideology rather than following the letter of the law that even President Obama himself said taking such actions under DACA would be unconstitutional. So yeah, as a conservative, I sit here and think that's why we need to have a strong ideological diversity on the court, so that one party can't just impose their will of judicial fiat based on political ideology rather than following the rule in the Constitution that they swore a oath to uphold.
So I spoke to a federal district court judge the other day, DC trial judge, and he said, I believe it was last year, only 14 criminal trials took place in the District of Columbia in an entire year. And the pendulum has swung so far against going to trial, mostly because of mandatory minimums and all the plea bargaining and all this sort of thing. The cost of civil litigation, as everybody knows, is through the roof. So there's far more settlements. And I think the expansion of the administrative state has caused a lot of regulatory pleadings that never have anything to do with Congress or the courts, just people, companies in particular, settling these actions under these obtuse regulations. And so I think the fact that the Trump administration is trying to dismantle some of that, the number of judges who are getting through the process, which the Democrats have tried to slow down as much as they can, there's now, I think, 30 hours of mandatory debate per nominee, which is just mind-boggling to me that they were able to invoke that rule. But most of these judges are very young. And we saw some of the hearings where some of them were a little inexperienced, and they had to be replaced by someone else. But they're
You're being so polite.
but the fact that they're taking the long view and they're trying to get as many younger judges on the bench as they can is a good thing, I think. I think this movement to try and possibly enact some sort of criminal justice reform is bringing together all kinds of strange bedfellows. I think the last one I saw was Valerie Jarrett had paired up with the Koch brothers to come out in favor of criminal justice reform and try and get some of these changes made so that there are more trials, so that litigation is open to more people. And I think that's a good thing for our democracy. I think if the more we can change that, the better. And I think the big government crowd that thinks that government knows best and everybody just please agree with us, that's the pendulum swinging against that. And the other place you see it, I think, is campuses on the Title IX issue, and the number of faculty committees that are adjudicating sexual assault. If you believe, as I do, that rape is the second worst crime you can commit, second to murder, you would want the police and the courts involved, and so that truth can come to light and not be discussed by counselors who are not trained in that. So I think all of this is adding to a pendulum moving away from the way it is right now, and the more the Trump administration can do that, I think more conservatives would support that.
Is this on? Mm-hmm. Oh. As by and large a Democrat, I find it always astonishing how almost completely I agree with the principles laid out by the conservatives, which I don't think is completely a delusion on my part. I mean,
maybe you should join us.
Yeah, no.
It's not too late.
I don't think it's a delusion on my part. I think that the sort of evolution from the 50s to the present has been a gradual convergence of what I would call the conservative instinct and the liberal progressive. I mean, let's go back to Clinton, the famous triangulation. But what really is interesting is that while I think there has been at the center a tremendous convergence in many ways with a number of hot button cultural issues, which are important, I'm not discounting those, moral, cultural issues. The convergence is to me far more interesting and significant, and yet something is still not being addressed by either side adequately. I think, for example, of that American Affairs journal that came out around the time Trump was elected to be sort of Trump's brain, and how it soon disaffiliated itself somewhat with Trump when he started behaving a little like Trump, a little erratically and making what's racist-seeming remarks and so on. But it continued to represent or see itself as advancing some of the ideas that Trump articulated in the election. And Trump, remember, was until recently a lifelong Democrat. Again, proving, I think, to some degree my point. And what Trump was trying to address, and I would agree very much with you, is this sense of a sort of people left behind. That was the genius of his campaign. He reached out to those people being left behind, and he was aware that there were many more other people, particularly white people, who were feared being left behind. And I would say, so far, I don't think he's done anything substantial to help those people being left behind. Above all, this wonderful tax benefit to the corporations, so far, maybe that will change, but you know as well as I, that capital is sitting stagnant. Where is the reinvestment in America at the level of infrastructure, at the level of small business? It's not really happening. And I'm not saying this is a unique failure of the Republican Party. I think the Democratic Party, as you said earlier, Hillary became the party of the speaker for Wall Street to a large extent. But I think both parties have failed a larger America. But I do think the rhetorical heat that I hear now, even among this very intelligent panel, is sometimes just risible. I mean, the fact to say that the gun debate is over the Second Amendment.
So would you say that your question is?
So I'm saying, how do we calm the rhetoric and get to the substance of our political economy?
And maybe a good question for the panel is that right? I mean, is there a division on the level of rhetoric, or is this a real values division that we're talking about?
I kind of want to address the tax issue, which is to partly agree. Like, I don't think that a lot of the people who voted for Donald Trump were thinking corporate tax reform was what they wanted more than anything else. Having said that, even with the acknowledgement that this was written by a bunch of DC lobbyists, I do think this tax reform and tax reduction bill was done in a smart manner with an idea toward incentivizing corporations to stop sending all their money overseas, and that the long tail of the effect of that, where you're giving people every reason to invest in the country, or making it just much more reasonable to not park all your money and resources outside the borders. That is something that will take a while to achieve, but it was a really smart idea that looked at some of the foundational problems with our tax policy and how people aren't bad for putting their money overseas. They were just doing what made sense. And corporations exist to make profits, and if that's the best way to secure your profits. There were other aspects of that bill that were focused on, again, more like material growth in this country, which will have second and third order effects that do help people who have faced some of the problems of our trade policy over the last few decades. But I kind of agree with the overall point. Like, people were hoping for something that maybe they're not seeing fully realized. Unfortunately, a lot of those issues are really complex, and the incentive structure is such that people don't want to have healthy debate about it. Immigration being a prime example. There are political reasons why you don't want to fix immigration, if you're one party or the other. And that's unfortunate, because I think people have said, we would like to have an immigration policy different than what we have, have it as radical as Canada's or Australia's, which are totally, I think, reasonable, merit-based policies. But the structure of the debate is incentivized against coming together.
I get asked this all the time as a speechwriter, to your final point about communications and the rhetoric and how do you take it down a notch. And so there are people, like, I believe you can separate the way the president is speaking and what he is doing. And I can easily disavow the way he goes about things and some of the words he uses, some of the hot buttons he hits. Some of that I find reprehensible. Do I find that disqualifying so that I could never support anything he does? No. But there are conservatives who will say, I'm sorry, because of the way he does it, I'm out, right? I can sort of compartmentalize it a little bit, because I'm often asked, like, for example, the other day he spoke at the FBI Academy. I was on with a liberal counterpart, and the president gave a speech that was what I would say was a standard Republican law and order speech. The problem is, the night before, he had been tweeting about how morally bankrupt the leadership of the FBI was. And then but the speech was to the line agents, saying what a great job they were doing. And my liberal counterpart just had his head exploding, saying that the president was lying to the line agents, and clearly this isn't what he really thinks, because when he tweets, that's what he really thinks. And I had to say, look, let's separate the two. If you want to have a discussion about his Twitter account, we can talk about that. But you asked me to analyze this speech. This was a speech that any president, including Bill Clinton, could have given. It was a standard law and order speech. The problem is usually not the speeches, though. And the problem is what's coming out of Twitter, and that just stirs the pot and gets the rhetoric going on both sides. So if you can sort of compartmentalize it, that's how I think most people handle it, that you can comment on this in this way, and you can comment on that way. And that's what's gotten me through it, sort of calling the balls and the strikes.
Let me answer this very quickly. First of all, I give you the invitation to join the dark side of the Force. You can come in.
Come on over.
Anytime you want to come over.
It's the dark intellectual web.
I agree with what these two ladies have said, and I would take it a step further and say it's hard to work with people that you demonize. And I think there's been such a demonization of the political process that in order for me to win, Mary Kate has to lose. And in order for her to lose, not only do I have to beat her, but I have to destroy her and annihilate her. And I think that's what's going on in our political discourse right now, is that Republicans and Democrats are sort of talking over each other and want to be ideologically pure and destroy the other side, whereas I think you're going to get a lot more done, and we were able to get a lot more things accomplished when you can say, fine, Molly gets 50% of what she wants, darn it, but I'm going to get 50% of what I want, but we both win. And how do you change that paradigm that I have to destroy her to we can all get a little bit of something and we can all win?
Reagan's 80-20. Yeah.
80-20, yeah. And I look back to welfare reform when I worked for Governor Kasich, well, I guess I can call him Governor Kasich, then chairman of the Budget Committee. I mean, we negotiated with the White House again and again and again on work requirements and how long can you stay on welfare, and we all got what we wanted. And then the president was able to go out and tout a strong accomplishment for him, and we were able to say, using the reconciliation process in the House, that we were able to deliver to the Republican constituencies.
Yeah.
I think we've got a theme here. Republicans are the party of ideas and issues. Ideas and issues lead to debate and discussion. Then that leads a little bit to fussing and fuming, and exacerbated by the internet, leads to polarization even within the party. So how do we get back to a civil debate and clear communications about what we do and how we get along? Yeah.
Well, Governor, I'm going to take your fussing and fuming line back. Let me tell you, I think that we have a remarkable opportunity right now to come together as Americans, given all the challenges that we have, and say, look, let's just stop shooting at each other politically and lay out and articulate what we agree on first. Nikki mentioned in the introduction that I'm part of a group called No Labels, and we have a problem-solving caucus, and we have as many members who are Republicans in the House and the Senate as are Democrats. And when they sit down once a month, they literally sit down and say, what can we agree on as it relates to immigration or education or whatnot? And then the members actually circulate the legislation that they've sponsored and ask other people to co-sponsor, and to try to actually get a consensus that can go to the floor or can work in the committee process. But as long as we demonize people as you're on my team and that's the other team that I have to annihilate, as opposed to do the job that we were elected to serve and find a way to do it in a more civil way, I don't think it'll ever change. And the question is, can we change with the amount of money that's in the system that it favors, well, if you didn't vote the right way in a primary, then a super PAC's going to come and take you out in the primary. There has to be some way to allow people to exercise their First Amendment rights without the fear of being taken out by a hostile takeover by a super PAC.
We are going to take one more question.
One of the aspects of conservatism that's most important to me is that it embraces the aspiration of every individual within the framework of law, unlimited by the institutional overlay. One of the things I observed at the time of the election that surprised me a lot was not so much the ad hominem attacks on Trump, which personalities always evoke that kind of thing, but it was the legitimacy of his eligibility because he was a businessman and had not grown up in the political class. It's frightening to me to think that alongside of the administrative state, there seems to be a growing belief that the political class, both regardless of party, the political class is itself an impediment to individual realization, which I think is so much at the heart of conservatism. I just wonder if you have a comment on that.
I can, I the flip side of what you're saying is this frustration with the elites in Washington, and I certainly get that. But
Let me
yeah.
to say one other thing. It questions, so Trump, everything that he does, it's that he doesn't know what to do because he has not had prior experience in the political class.
Right.
And he does not know how to do it correctly in foreign affairs because he was never Secretary of State or something like that. America was built by people who found a way wherever they came from.
Right.
And so I really, this disturbs me a lot about what is happening within our society.
I say this to young people all the time, that that politics wasn't always the way it is now, and it can change. And not that long ago, we had plenty of great people who ran for office, who came from all walks of life, and we need more of that. And as some of the outrage about whether he released his tax returns or all this sort of thing, to me says, well, wait a minute, we've got an unprecedented situation in modern times where we have someone who's not from the political class, who has not had to release his taxes every year or jump through all the hoops that everybody has with security clearances and skeletons in their closet and this sort of thing. And we want to make sure that other people in the future can run for office and not have a problem that they're not in the political class. And it's in our best interest to have all kinds of people running for office. And we need to encourage more young people who may or may not, from day one, announce that they want to be president of the United States someday, come in and serve our country. And so we don't want to set up all these barriers that make it more and more difficult for people outside the political class to join, because I think there's a great benefit to having people, like you were saying, Victor Davis Hanson, a farmer who has tremendous political views, and that's the kind of person we want. So is that what you're saying, that you're concerned about that? Yeah.
Well, I also think it helps explain the other part that we've been talking about, which is this opposition. The election of Donald Trump, every expert in the world told us that it was impossible that it would happen. The fact that it happened is just such an indictment against their knowledge base, against their imagination, against their understanding of the world. And that's true whether they're in the media or whether they're in established conservative think tanks or if they're on the other side. And so I think part of what you're seeing in the resistance to him from those same communities is a hurt ego. People can't get over the fact that they were wrong. And it is totally understandable that you would feel bad that you were wrong, but that's when you fail, you should learn from that moment. And I would just also say, these people who like to present themselves as such fonts of wisdom when it comes to foreign policy or economic policy or national sovereignty issues have made some pretty catastrophic failures. And the idea that they would get to continue making those failures when the people say, you know what, we see what you did here, we're not pleased with it, and we are still into self-government. And that's what I want to kind of also make my final point, which is it is commonly viewed as like an eruption of anger that led to Donald Trump's victory. And I think it is probably more properly viewed as an act of hope that there can still be a self-government and a fight against those elites who control institutions and had built a system that could exist into perpetuity. It's commonly viewed as anger by the elites who were turned out, but it should probably people should think about the hope and the good that maybe can spread from that.
The only thing I'd say very briefly to that, when Molly says hope, is look at the hope that Bernie Sanders also brought out for progressives and younger people who felt disaffected by the Democratic elites. And the Bernie forces on one end and the Trump forces on the other, Republicans, Democrats, conservatives, progressives felt that the elites had let them down and weren't looking out for them. And I think that's really the takeaway from this election that I saw on the ground of, you've left us all behind, and who can we actually look to look after us?
That's a really good point.
Well, help me in thanking our panelists for a really great discussion.